think there's I'm reflecting back on the last conversation about branding and personal brand versus, you know, organizational brand. And I wanted to say to Eric, wherever he is, that he was flat out wrong when when he said that he didn't really have a personal brand. His brand was all tied up in Monster, right? So I'm sure almost everybody in the room who knows him would say, you're kidding, right? The Eric Weingartner brand, in my experience, is far more powerful than the Monster brand. Now, Monster might not want to hear that, but here's the deal. When I think about Monster, I think of Eric. When I think about Eric, there's a whole other set of reputational sort of attributes that I hear that, frankly, is a lot more powerful than Monster. I'm not in the recruiting business. I am looking for a job, but I'm not a recruiter.
Good timing. Good timing.
For all the thousands of people there in 33 countries.
By the way.
But I think that's kind of plays into this whole notion of social recruiting. And you know, I'm a simple person. It's about reputation, right? I mean, we can trick it up and call it brand, and we can, if you're you know, a Fortune 50 company, you can make it a bazillion-dollar budget and have strategies and complexities and stuff. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about is reputation. And so from a social recruiting perspective, what I think recruiters have to offer, the thing that they have to offer is a clear look into the culture of our organization. And you know, Kenneth Smith used to say, I don't know what culture is, but I recognize it when I see it. You know, somebody else says culture is the way we do things around here. And you can spend lots of money on fabulous branding, but if the branding doesn't actually align with and represent how we do things around here and what it feels like to be part of this tribe or a part of this community, you know, you just wasted, you know, a whole bunch of money. And so where the magic happens, I think, whether you're using the phone or you're using Twitter or you're using Facebook or any of the other technologies that are out there, is the magic happens when the brands are all in alignment and you're creating relationships of value, right? Well, I guess that's that would be the definition of a relationship is you know, the value on both sides, and creating those communities that do good on both sides of the equation.
Yeah, that just spurred something. I just have a quick question before we go on. How many of you have ever seen within a job posting, follow us on Twitter at such and such? Anybody ever seen that in a job posting? So there's like 3 hands that went up. So isn't that interesting? Like, apply for our job, but don't get too close. I mean, what's the message there? And if it's really about relationship building, if it's really about brand continuity, why wouldn't you see the brand's Twitter profile or the recruiter's Twitter profile, for instance, in every single job posting?
Or the recruiter's home address.
Well,
It's because the Twitter stream is just a reposting of that job ad, most likely, in my experience, not to be cynical. I would like us to redefine social recruiting as being sort of the opposite of transactional recruiting. So that, you know, when we talk about social recruiting, in my mind, it's a longer-term approach. It's thinking about recruiting in terms of building community, building relationship, building connectedness. And I think at the end of the day, it's about sort of creating social capital. That's the social part of it. It's not social networking. It's not social media. To me, it should be social capital. It's the value that we create and invest and grow within those relationships, so that I have a network of people that are invested in that I'm invested in their career, even if it's not right now, they don't work at my organization, but that I have some investment in them as a recruiter, and that they have some investment in me because they know that, you know, we have that relationship. And I think that if we went from, I think what gets in the way of this is that most of us get trapped in the, you know, under the pressures to be very transactional. It's the, you know, the fastest, cheapest way to get people through the door to fill jobs, and we're not building those relationships. Well, when you take that approach to social media or to anything, telephone, it feels inauthentic, it feels it doesn't resonate. You don't get that, so it breaks down. And I think that's a lot of what we've seen. So I guess the way I'd like to see us define it is that social recruiting is about social capital creation. It's about longer term relationship building in recruiting. And I think that if we took that approach, that would also probably go back to helping us solve some of our candidate Bill of Rights, because we'd treat people differently through the process if we were thinking longer term.
And wouldn't the ROI then of the recruiting function go up?
You would think.
Because you'd be making better placements. The alignment of the personal brand and the corporate brand would be much closer. And the alignment between the culture and the personality would be much closer. And so wouldn't you think that the hires would be better and stay longer?
I don't know.
And you'd be driving turnover
But isn't
down.
that probably where part of the disconnect is? I mean, doesn't it take longer, and it isn't a little bit trickier to show ROI because we're starting to talk about these intangible things that are harder to measure? And businesses don't tend to do real well with intangibles. Isn't that part of the disconnect here?
Well, it could be, but I think that would be easy to place a value on. If your time to hire is a little bit longer, but your placement is longer, I mean, if turnover is reduced, that, as a business leader, that feels like a good investment.
And I think you have to, manage expectations internally, because a little bit about what you're talking about is managing sort of the expectations around a startup business, right? In terms of what is it going to take to establish yourself with a strong brand socially. But the other thing is, I think a lot of times what's happening because of the way that social transactions are happening today versus investments, that people just keep flowing through. Most organizations have no way to capture that talent that's coming to their blog and convert them into some type of a profile, if you will, in their CRM or within their ATS, so they don't know. But I do think that the companies that are starting to figure this out are able to show, and it's part social, but it's partly bigger than that, because what Jason's talking about with talent communities, how do you measure that? And you measure that by showing what percentage of your hires were sourced from within your own talent community and delivered to the hiring manager and converted to a hire. And in most cases, you're going to find a significantly reduced time to hire, and you're going to find a significantly reduced cost, which isn't the only two things, but those are guiding metrics.
Quick question. Jason, you mentioned a potential waste of time. As a leader in talent acquisition, do you have any set guidelines, rules, or regulations that you have for your sourcing team to use these venues of social, recruiting? I
don't, simply because I hold them strictly, essentially accountable for the outcomes. So if we're meeting sort of the, and I mean, there's a number of metrics, but in essence, if we're getting the right people in the right jobs to the satisfaction of our internal customers, I don't care how they do it. If they're doing it, I mean, they will, I guess my expectation is they'll find the most efficient way. Right. And we don't use a ton of, they use social media when it's appropriate and where it's appropriate, but we can't make Twitter work.
Right, exactly. Well, I was just asking, when it comes to, portraying your corporate brand or your employment brand, is there set guidelines that you have in place for your recruiting staff? Please follow these guidelines when going here to find, potential candidates for these recs. So,
we have an internal social media policy, probably like a lot of organizations do, and we've been probably a little because we're conservative and in the banking industry and in the Midwest. We've been very slow kind of stepping into that because of brand, a pretty tightly held brand. But yeah, there's guidelines, and we partner very closely with our marketing group, and we're in lockstep with them to make sure what we're doing. But what I would tell you is we're not, as an example, we haven't invested heavily in that kind of interaction, largely because we found that our local community in Lincoln, Nebraska isn't super social network savvy at this point, and so telephone calls seems to work better. Emails work better for us at this point. So yeah.
Thank you, guys.
A good guideline would probably be to spend less time on Twitter than I do. That would be a starting point.
That's easy.
Yeah, it is easy usually. But I think you mentioned something really important, that you couldn't find a way to make Twitter work for you, and I think that speaks to part of the problem on this topic area, because there's people out there that think everyone should be on Twitter, and there's people out there that think Twitter's of no value to anybody, and I think both of those are poorly informed decisions. That speaks to me that you have not spent any time trying to figure out what the tool is and how you would use it. It's not for everybody, but make those decisions and be well informed about them. Figure out what other people are doing. Think about how it might play a role in your strategy. If it's not for you, then it's not for you, but don't just make that statement or come to that decision without having spent some time making sure that you understand those tools and how to use them in a social way.
Well, and I think it's also important to differentiate sort of leveraging social media tools for your own. I mean, I think this is you connected it back to the brand discussion. I personally use Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook a lot, and I find enormous value for myself in development, and some of my team uses those tools for development and different reasons and building relationships and networking and that. We just haven't been able to find the special sauce that makes Twitter work for recruiting in Nebraska yet.
Well, and I think that's a really important distinction, and a good strategy would identify that, and a good leader obviously identifies that, because you've got to know, who your audience is, where they are, and what's right for them. The other piece I think it's important for companies to think about is if you're trying to manage social recruiting within your strategy today with yesterday's recruiting structure, chances are it's not going to work. Because number one, not every recruiter is going to have the skills or be adept at doing it. Now, there's certain things you can do to help, them acclimate and move them along. But some of you may have seen, me write on the idea of community managers. You've seen others write on the idea of community managers. It's borrowed from the consumer space. That's a critical role today. And I think an organization trying to tackle social recruiting without a community manager potentially is setting themselves up for failure or recruiter burnout, one of the two. Because it's just not sustainable.
And I want to go back to kind of the original disconnect that we talked about the fact that social recruiting tends to be not a lot about the social part of it. And I wonder if that's part of a deeper problem facing business today, and that we still focus on these very tangible things, and we haven't transitioned into a different way of doing business. I believe very strongly that culture beats strategy every day. I believe very strongly that intangibles are far more powerful than tangibles. I believe very strongly that ecology comes before technology, but that doesn't seem to be translating into the way that we do business yet. Most of the companies that I see using social media tools are not using them in a social way. They're using them in a broadcast way. And I think they're probably not going to get a terribly good ROI on that. What's at the root of that disconnect? I think that, and it doesn't just affect this body of work that we're talking about today, but it also affects a lot of other stuff as well.